For 14 years, the rusted gates of the Harrington estate remained padlocked, hiding a decaying farmhouse and a secret that cost a family its soul. When 28-year-old Clara inherited the ruins, she expected a burden. Instead, she unearthed a $15 million conspiracy that someone was still willing to kill for. The rain was lashing against the thin glass of Clara Jenkins's cramped Chicago apartment when the phone call finally came. It was a Tuesday evening, and she was halfway through grading her 5th stack of middle school English essays, her bank account hovering precariously close to single digits. The voice on the other end of the line was dry, gravelly, and laced with a formal southern drawl that Clara had not heard since she was a teenager. It was Thomas Higgins, an attorney based out of a small, affluent county in North Carolina. He informed her, with a chilling lack of emotion, that her grandmother, Beatrice Harrington, had passed away. Clara felt no tears prick her eyes. There was only a hollow, echoing silence in her chest. She had not spoken to Beatrice in 14 years. When Clara's mother died in a tragic car accident, Beatrice had coldly sent 14-year-old Clara away to a boarding school on a meager scholarship, effectively washing her hands of the girl. The Harrington family, once local royalty in the rural outskirts of Asheville, had closed its ranks. Clara was an outcast, left to fend for herself in a world that demanded resilience. So when Thomas Higgins demanded her presence at the reading of the will, her first instinct was to hang up. But the lawyer's next words stopped her cold. "You are the primary beneficiary, Miss Jenkins. I highly advise you to be here on Friday morning." 3 days later, Clara sat in the oppressive mahogany-paneled conference room of Higgins & Lowe. The air was thick with the smell of lemon polish and bitter resentment. Across the polished table sat her Aunt Margaret, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in a scowl of aristocratic disdain, and her cousin Bradley, who was aggressively tapping his Rolex against the wood. Margaret had spent the last decade hovering around Beatrice like a vulture, eagerly anticipating the moment she would inherit the sprawling, 200-acre Harrington farm and the liquid assets that supposedly remained from the family's old textile fortune. Thomas Higgins cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. He read through the standard legal jargon, distributing minor sums to former staff members and local charities. Then he reached the estate. "To my daughter, Margaret," Higgins read, his voice steady. "I leave the sum of $10,000 and the antique silver collection. To my grandson, Bradley, I leave my vintage Mercedes-Benz." Margaret's face drained of color. "That's impossible. What about the farm? What about the investment portfolios?" Higgins did not look up. "To my estranged granddaughter, Clara Jenkins, I leave the entirety of the Bramblewood farm, the manor house, the surrounding 200 acres, and all contents within. I do this in the hope that she might forgive an old woman's cowardice and finish what I could not." The room erupted. Margaret slammed her hands on the table, her voice shrill and venomous, accusing Clara of fraud, manipulation, and every sin under the sun. Clara just sat there, stunned into absolute silence. She hadn't seen the woman in over a decade. Why would Beatrice leave her the entire estate? It made no sense. By mid-afternoon, Clara was driving a rented sedan down the winding, overgrown dirt road that led to Bramblewood Farm. The canopy of ancient oak trees blocked out the sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hood of the car. When she finally reached the main gate, the sheer scale of the neglect took her breath away. The grand Victorian farmhouse, once painted a pristine white, was peeling and grey, looking like a rotting tooth jutting out of the overgrown weeds. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle. Vines choked the brick chimneys, and several upper-story windows were boarded shut. Clara unlocked the heavy oak front door with the brass key Higgins had given her. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air was stale, smelling intensely of dust, dried lavender, and something distinctly metallic. White sheets covered the furniture like ghosts in the dim light. Clara walked slowly through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. It was a mausoleum of a forgotten era. As she moved into her grandmother's old study, she noticed something strange. While the rest of the house was blanketed in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, the study looked as though a hurricane had ripped through it. Books were thrown from the shelves, their spines cracked. The heavy oak desk had been pulled away from the wall, its drawers yanked out and dumped onto the Persian rug. The upholstery of the leather armchair had been slashed open, the yellow foam spilling out like innards. Someone had been looking for something. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She backed away from the desk, her eyes scanning the wreckage. Margaret's furious face flashed in her mind. Had her aunt come here to search for the investment bonds? Among the scattered papers on the floor, Clara noticed a small, pale blue envelope tucked halfway under the baseboard, almost completely hidden by a fallen encyclopedia. She knelt down and pulled it free. The envelope was sealed with cracked red wax. Clara broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a single piece of stationery, written in Beatrice's elegant, looping cursive. Clara, if you are reading this, I am dead, and the wolves are already circling. I pushed you away to protect you, but I am out of time. They think the money is gone. It isn't. It is here, buried in the bones of this house. Trust no one, especially not the blood in your own veins. Find the weeping angel. Beatrice. Clara stared at the letter, a chill racing down her spine. The inheritance wasn't just a rotting farm. It was a treasure map and a warning. Clara spent her first night at Bramblewood Farm, huddled on a lumpy mattress in the only guest room that didn't smell entirely of mildew. Outside, a summer thunderstorm battered the county, rattling the loose window panes and sending ominous shadows dancing across the floral wallpaper. She barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind sounded like footsteps pacing the hallway outside her door. She kept Beatrice's cryptic note clutched in her hand. The words burned into her memory. Find the weeping angel. When morning broke, casting a pale, washed-out light over the overgrown estate, Clara decided she couldn't stay in the house alone. She drove into town and visited the local hardware store to buy new deadbolts, flashlights, and cleaning supplies. While there, she asked the cashier for a recommendation for a local contractor, someone who could at least make the roof stop leaking. An hour later, Daniel Reed pulled his battered Ford pickup into the driveway of Bramblewood Farm. Daniel was a quiet, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, with calloused hands and a reputation for keeping his mouth shut, exactly what Clara needed. She paid him up front to fix the sagging porch and patch the holes in the attic roof. While Daniel worked outside, Clara began the exhausting task of clearing out the study. She bagged up the shredded leather, stacked the discarded books, and tried to make sense of the chaotic financial records Beatrice had left behind. According to the tax documents, the Harrington estate had been virtually bankrupt since 1998. The textile mills had closed, the stock portfolios had crashed, and Beatrice had taken out multiple mortgages just to pay the property taxes. Yet the letter spoke of money, lots of it. Around noon, heavy boots thumped down the main staircase. Daniel appeared in the doorway of the study, wiping sweat and drywall dust from his brow. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice hesitant, "you might want to come up to the attic. I found something you need to see. Clara followed him up the narrow, winding staircase to the 3rd floor. The attic was sweltering, filled with broken furniture, dusty dressers, and antique trunks. Daniel led her to the far corner, near the brick chimney, where he had pulled up several rotting floorboards to access a leak. I was trying to replace the joist here, Daniel explained, pointing a heavy flashlight into the dark cavity between the floor and the ceiling of the room below. But it's not just a gap, it's a false floor. Someone built a custom compartment right between the beams. Clara knelt down, ignoring the splinters digging into her jeans, and peered into the darkness. Resting inside the dusty void was a heavy, military-grade steel lockbox. It took both Clara and Daniel to hoist it out of the floorboards. The box was covered in decades of grime, but the heavy brass padlock holding it shut was surprisingly free of rust, as if it had been handled recently. "Do you have the key for that?" Daniel asked, stepping back. Clara shook her head. "No. Can you break it open?" Daniel retrieved a crowbar from his tool belt. With a grunt of effort, he wedged the iron bar under the padlock and heaved. The brass snapped with a sharp crack that echoed loudly in the stifling attic. Clara threw open the lid. Inside the box were 3 items. The first was a thick, leather-bound ledger dating back to 1985. The second was a heavy, rusted iron skeleton key, completely different from any lock Clara had seen in the house. The third item made the breath hitch in Clara's throat. It was a single, heavy gold bar, wrapped partially in velvet, stamped with the insignia of a Swiss bank. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Lady, I don't know what kind of farm your grandmother was running, but that right there is worth a small fortune." Clara carefully lifted the ledger. As she flipped through the yellowed pages, she realized it wasn't a record of the family's textile business. It was a log of illicit transactions. Millions of dollars in offshore transfers, real estate shell companies, and untraceable precious metals, all orchestrated by Beatrice's late husband, Clara's grandfather, right before the family supposedly went bankrupt. The money hadn't vanished in a stock market crash. It had been systematically drained, converted, and hidden. At the very back of the ledger, Clara found a loose piece of paper folded in half. It was a hand-drawn map of the Bramblewood estate, with a single red X marked near the old family cemetery on the eastern edge of the property. Next to the X were 2 words, "The Angel." "I need to ask you a favor, Daniel," Clara said, looking up from the box, her heart racing. "I need you to not tell a single soul about what we just found. I'll double your hourly rate. I'll pay you whatever you want. But no one can know." Daniel looked at the gold, then at Clara's terrified expression. He slowly nodded. "My lips are sealed, Miss Jenkins, but if I were you, I'd get a security system. Whoever tore up your study downstairs is going to come back when they realize they didn't find what they were looking for." That evening, after Daniel left, Clara sat at the kitchen table, the heavy iron key resting against the wood. She poured herself a glass of water, trying to steady her shaking hands. $15 million. That was the total sum recorded at the end of the ledger. Her grandmother had been sitting on a hidden empire of wealth while living in a decaying house, pretending to be broke. But why? Who was she hiding it from? Suddenly, the motion sensor light Daniel had installed on the back porch flicked on, casting a harsh, blinding beam through the kitchen window. Clara froze. She held her breath, listening. Over the hum of the old refrigerator, she heard the distinct crunch of heavy boots on the gravel driveway. Then the slow, agonizing creak of the back porch stairs, groaning under the weight of someone approaching the door. Clara slowly reached into her bag and wrapped her fingers around the heavy iron crowbar Daniel had accidentally left behind. The doorknob began to rattle. The heavy brass doorknob of the kitchen door violently twisted back and forth, the ancient lock straining against the force of the intruder. Clara Jenkins backed away, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the heavy iron crowbar. The summer storm outside had intensified, masking the sounds of the struggle with loud claps of thunder. Suddenly, a fist wrapped in a heavy flannel shirt smashed through the glass pane of the door. Shards of glass exploded across the linoleum floor. A hand reached through the jagged opening, blindly fumbling for the deadbolt Daniel had installed just hours earlier. Clara did not hesitate. Driven by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, she swung the crowbar downward, striking the intruder's forearm with a sickening crunch. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the porch, followed by a string of vicious curses. The hand retracted instantly. Clara lunged forward, pressing her weight against the door as she shouted, "I have a gun! I swear to God I will shoot you through this door!" It was a bluff, but the voice that shouted back made the blood freeze in her veins. "Clara, stop! It's me! It's Bradley! It's—" Clara paused, her chest heaving. She peered cautiously through the shattered window pane. Standing on the porch, clutching his bleeding arm in the pouring rain, was her cousin. His designer clothes were soaked, and his usually perfectly coiffed hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked nothing like the arrogant heir who had tapped his Rolex at the lawyer's office. He looked desperate, cornered, and dangerous. "What are you doing here, Bradley?" Clara demanded, keeping the crowbar raised. "Did you tear up the study? Were you the one searching the house?" Bradley grimaced, leaning against the wooden railing. "Let me in, Clara. You don't understand what's at stake here. My mother and we owe people. Bad people. Grandmother promised us that money. We know it's here. We know about the offshore accounts and the gold. You have to share it with us, or they are going to ruin us." "There is no money," Clara lied smoothly, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic hammering of her heart. "The estate is bankrupt. The lawyer said so himself." "Thomas Higgins is a liar," Bradley spat, his eyes wide with frantic intensity. "He's been trying to find the stash for years. My mother figured it out too late. Beatrice hid it, Clara. She hid it to punish us. If you found something, you need to hand it over, now." "Get off my property," Clara ordered, her tone turning to ice. "I am calling the police. If you are still here in 5 minutes, I'm pressing charges for breaking and entering." Bradley stared at her, a mixture of rage and terror crossing his face. He took a step forward, but the piercing wail of a police siren in the distance, likely responding to a downed tree from the storm, made him freeze. Believing Clara had already made the call, Bradley turned and bolted into the heavy rain, his tires tearing up the gravel driveway moments later as he sped off into the night. Clara collapsed into a kitchen chair, shaking uncontrollably. Bradley's words echoed in her mind. "Thomas Higgins is a liar. He's been trying to find the stash for years." She realized with horrifying clarity that Beatrice hadn't just left her a fortune. She had left her in the middle of a war zone. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air thick with humidity. Clara called Daniel Reed at the crack of dawn. When his battered Ford pulled up, she explained everything: the break-in, Bradley's confession, and the lawyer's potential involvement. Daniel listened quietly, his jaw set in a hard line. He retrieved a heavy hunting rifle from the back of his truck and slung it over his shoulder. "If they think you found something, they'll be back," Daniel said gravely. "We need to find this weeping angel today, Miss Jenkins. Get whatever is buried out of the ground and get you to a safe place." Clara grabbed the iron skeleton key and the hand-drawn map from the lockbox. Together, they hiked toward the eastern edge of the 200-acre estate. The terrain grew wilder the further they walked. Briars tore at Clara's jeans, and the thick canopy of oak and pine trees blocked out the morning sun, casting the forest in an eerie, green twilight. After 30 minutes of bushwhacking, they broke through a dense thicket of rhododendrons and stepped into a small, forgotten clearing. It was the old Harrington family cemetery. The wrought iron fence surrounding the plots was rusted and overgrown with poison ivy. Gravestones dating back to the 1800s jutted out of the earth at odd, sunken angles. Clara's eyes frantically scanned the decaying markers. "The map marked an X right on the edge of the plots," she muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Look!" Daniel pointed toward the far corner of the cemetery, where a massive ancient willow tree draped its weeping branches over a large stone structure. It was a mausoleum, constructed of heavy grey granite. And resting atop the arched doorway was a life-sized stone statue of an angel, its face buried in its hands, weeping. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She approached the mausoleum slowly, the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots echoing like gunshots in the quiet woods. The heavy iron door of the crypt was secured by a massive antique padlock that looked identical in make to the one they had broken off the lockbox in the attic. The keyhole was large and strangely shaped. Clara reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold iron of the skeleton key Beatrice had left her. "This is it," Clara whispered. "This is where she hid it." "Where?" Clara's hands trembled as she inserted the heavy iron skeleton key into the mausoleum's padlock. The metal groaned in protest, stiff with years of neglect and rust. With Daniel's calloused hand placed firmly over hers, they turned the key together. A loud, satisfying click resonated through the humid air. The lock gave way. Daniel pulled the heavy chain free and hauled the granite and iron door open. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, smelling of old stone and dry earth. Clara clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight and stepped into the gloom. The interior of the mausoleum was small, containing 4 elevated stone sarcophagi, meant for the Harrington ancestors. But the space between the tombs was not empty. Stacked neatly against the back wall were dozens of waterproof, military-grade Pelican cases. Clara knelt beside the nearest case and snapped open the heavy latches. She threw back the lid and gasped. The case was packed to the brim with neatly banded stacks of $100 bills, perfectly preserved. Daniel opened the next case, revealing rows of heavy gold bullion, identical to the single bar they had found in the attic lockbox. A third case held thick stacks of bearer bonds and property deeds to prime real estate across the country. "Good Lord," Daniel breathed, shining his light over the incredible hoard. She really did it. She liquidated the entire family empire and buried it in a graveyard. She knew Margaret and Bradley would squander it, Clara realized aloud, tracing the edge of a gold bar. And she knew the lawyer was trying to steal it. She hid it all to protect the legacy, and she left it to me because I was the only one who never asked her for a dime. How touching! A dry, gravelly voice echoed from the entrance of the mausoleum. Clara and Daniel spun around. Standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit, was Thomas Higgins. The attorney's usually immaculate suit was damp from the wet brush, and his face was twisted into a cruel, triumphant smile. Beside him stood Aunt Margaret, her eyes wid with a manic greed as she stared past Clara at the open cases of wealth. In Higgins's right hand, leveled directly at Daniel's chest, was a sleek, black revolver. "Drop the rifle, Mr. Reed," Higgins ordered, cocking the hammer. "Slowly. Kick it to the side." Daniel locked eyes with Clara for a split second before slowly lowering his hunting rifle to the stone floor and pushing it away with his boot. "You," Clara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and anger. "You were the one helping my grandfather launder this money. I was the architect of this entire fortune, Miss Jenkins," Higgins sneered, stepping further into the crypt. "Your grandfather was a fool, but he knew how to make money. I showed him how to hide it from the IRS. When he died, Beatrice was supposed to cut me in. Instead, the old bat moved the assets and played the penniless widow for a decade and a half. I've searched every inch of that rotting farmhouse. I never thought to look in the crypt. It belongs to us, Thomas," Margaret shrieked, pushing past the lawyer to grab at the nearest case of cash. "Bradley and I deserve this. We stayed with her." "Shut up, Margaret," Higgins snapped, keeping the gun trained on Clara and Daniel. "You and your idiot son are getting nothing. I'm taking the gold and the bonds. You can burn with the house, for all I care." "You're not going to get away with this," Clara said, stepping slightly to her left, inching closer to the heavy iron door. "Bradley knows you're looking for it. The police were already called to the house last night." "The local sheriff is a friend of mine, Clara," Higgins chuckled darkly. "He'll believe whatever I tell him. Now, back away from the cases." "Actually, Higgins," a new, booming voice echoed from the woods outside, "I wouldn't be so sure about that." Higgins whipped around, but it was too late. Sheriff Miller, a towering man with a thick grey mustache, stood just outside the mausoleum, his service weapon drawn and pointed squarely at the attorney's head. Behind him were 3 heavily armed deputies. "Drop the weapon, Tom," Sheriff Miller barked. Higgins froze, the color draining from his face. He looked at the fortune, then at the deputies, before slowly lowering his revolver to the ground. Margaret screamed as 2 deputies rushed in, securing her wrists in zip ties and shoving Higgins against the stone wall of the crypt. Clara exhaled a shaky breath, her knees nearly buckling as the adrenaline finally crashed. Daniel caught her arm, steadying her. "How did you know?" Clara asked Daniel in a whisper, as the police read Higgins and Margaret their rights. Daniel offered a rare, genuine smile. "When you told me about the lawyer this morning, I texted Sheriff Miller. We served in the military together. I figured if we were going digging for buried treasure, it wouldn't hurt to have some backup waiting in the woods." By nightfall, the Harrington farm was swarming with federal agents and state police, securing the $15 million fortune. Margaret, Bradley, and Thomas Higgins were all facing decades in federal prison for extortion, conspiracy, and attempted armed robbery. Clara stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the overgrown yard. The farm was still rotting, the roof was still leaking, and the ghosts of her family's past still lingered in the hallways. But as she looked down at the iron skeleton key in her hand, she knew everything was about to change. She wasn't the abandoned outcast anymore. She was the master of Bramblewood Farm. Clara's terrifying journey from a struggling teacher to the heir of a $15 million hidden empire proves that some family secrets are worth fighting for. What would you have done if you found that map in the attic? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this real-life treasure hunt full of greed, betrayal, and ultimate justice, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories.